Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. On this episode, I talked with Valentina Devid. The main focus of our conversation was about the importance of moving beyond just formative assessment to embracing formative action. This was a lot of fun, and I asked Valentina to walk us through their 5-step short loop of formative action she and her colleagues use with schools, and we used that as a jumping off point to talk about related issues like efficiency, varied academic outcomes, the tension between limited time and responsive teaching, and several other things. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, weakerteachers.com, for more information on our professional learning. And I'll also note that cohort number 1 for our PBL Grow 26 Summer Learning event focused on project-based learning is full, and we're taking registrations for cohort number 2. That's June 15th through 17th in Louisville, Kentucky. And all registrants get a year of access to our AI PBL design tool built in collaboration with Inquire. More information is on wegrowteachers.com, and you'll see a link at the very top of the page. Now, here's my conversation with Valentina. I am with Valentina Devid, and we're going to talk formative action and probably much more, but I want to welcome her and give her the usual opportunity to introduce herself and give us a little background. So welcome, and here's your chance. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, well, so thank you for having me, first of all. And my name is Valentina, and I started my educational journey as a history teacher, and I taught history and religion, actually. And for me, I was just full of questions. So I remember like standing in the classroom and I was looking at the children and the teenagers, and I was like, okay, is this it? You know, these 4 walls, these children, am I going to do this for the rest of my life? And I had so many questions about teaching still and about learning. And I came to the conclusion that I did not know that much, actually. So I was just fresh out of teacher training academy or, program, how you want to call it. And so I thought, okay, I need to know more. So I started with asking my colleagues lots of questions, and they just found me very annoying. And they were like, yeah, we've been doing this for years this way. So, just get on with it and stop asking all these annoying questions. So that was a dead end. So then I turned to a master's. So I did a master's called Learning and Innovation. And I remember when I started that, I was like, okay, here are all the other crazies, all the other nerds who really want to, get to the bottom and have also a lot of questions. I want to know more about teaching and learning. So that was really a very, very nice environment. And I came across formative assessment, as it was called back then, at least in the Netherlands. And I introduced that in my own classroom and with a couple of colleagues and implemented it. And in the beginning, I did not know anything about it. So I was like quite skeptical even. So I thought, okay, what kind of hype is this? The next big thing, woo. But then I noticed the difference in my classroom. I noticed the difference with my students, and I noticed difference in my own teaching, and discovering that I knew way better what I was doing and what they were actually learning. And I remember that the results went up and their type of questions changed. And one girl came up to me and said like, yeah, miss, can you explain to me this learning objective once more? Because I noticed that I keep on struggling with that in my, quizzes that we were doing. And I was like, what? What is happening here? Can somebody, pinch me? This never happened before. So I guess then my fascination with the whole concept of formative action was born. And I implemented it in my own, in the whole high school that I was working back then. And I became also a school leader to lead the whole project and the whole innovation, of course. And then I just rolled into also teacher training and doing professional development in other schools. And people just kept on asking me to come back. So I did. And then I combined the 2 jobs for quite a while. That was really intense. And I worked also in a teacher training at the university for a period. And then I just met other colleagues and we started our own professional development company. And that just exploded. So for the last 5-6 years, I've been traveling all over the Netherlands, where I'm based, in Europe, and now also traveling more abroad, all with my fascination that started in my own classroom with formative assessment and the research I did behind it. And we like to call it now in the Netherlands formative action. And I'm trying to also get that concept and that term more internationally known. So that's me, I guess.
Okay. Well, so we're going to dive into formative action, but a couple things before we get there. So you mentioned your work and your colleagues. Who are those colleagues?
René Knijber and Dominique Slijsmans are the ones I started the company with, and we're now with almost 20 or around 20 people. So we grew very fast, and yeah, we're specialized in formative action and professional development, but also we are now diving more in instructional coaching because that's really new in the Netherlands, and also trying to do instructional coaching on formative action, but also in everything that we do, we really would try to have like sustainable change in schools. And
imagine that.
Yeah, that's really something and quite hard to do. So we really, that's our mission, to improve education, but do it in a very sustainable way. So yeah, I guess that's how it all went.
Yeah. So just kind of give a little more color. So you mentioned some of the teacher training and that kind of thing. What was your, I guess you're here in the States, we call it K-12. I don't know what they call it if you went to school in the Netherlands, but what was that like? What was that experience like? Was it more traditional? Was it maybe a bit more, might say progressive or mix, or how would you characterize that?
I guess it was pretty traditional. It was very, well, you just had classes and you had different subjects and you just went from class to class, from subject to subject. And every chapter, you had a test or an assessment at the end of the whole chapter. So it was pretty standard, I guess, pretty how you would think of high school or think of school. And but in the Netherlands, I guess the culture is quite different, maybe from, of course, every culture is different, but the culture in the Netherlands in schools is very much about autonomy. So we really are fond of our own teachers' autonomy, but we also really want our students to be self-regulated learners a lot. We really put a lot of emphasis on that, but at the same time, we struggle with it because we are now also, we see that the results are declining in the Netherlands. We've always been scoring quite okay, but now you see that the test results are not as good as they used to be, and reading and literacy and maths are not doing as well. So I guess the Netherlands is now a bit in a more, I don't know. It's not, I would not say crisis, but I guess it needs to reinvent itself in educational sense. Like, what is really our core and what do we think is important? So you also see a push more towards evidence-based or evidence-informed education. And of course, you always have camps, like, the ones who are really like, no, this is the answer to everything. And I guess everywhere, but also here in the Netherlands on LinkedIn, it can be like bloody fights.
Yes, I'm familiar with some of those. Yes. Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, because you mentioned something maybe a bit more traditional as a young student, but then you opened that up to something a little bit more focused on self-directedness. Because when you were first talking, you were talking about how much I guess you value questions and questioning, which is right in my wheelhouse. You're speaking to the choir, right? And I'm a self-avowed inquiry advocate, and therein lies some of those camps and fighting, that kind of thing. Would you say your I guess childhood education is what fostered that love of questions, or was it your home life, or a mix of all of those things, or where'd that come from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess, well, I started teaching religion actually because it was really difficult to find a job as a history teacher. And when I was doing my internship, I remember that a teacher in the school gave me that tip, like if you graduate and you're finished your teacher training program and you have difficulty finding a job, because I already knew it was going to be difficult, especially as a history teacher. He said, you can always apply to teach religion. And, and I was doing a minor in religion as well. And he said, yeah, that's way easier. And, they're not as strict with diplomas and everything. So I did that because I was, turned down.
You needed a job, right? Yeah.
I needed a job.
Yeah. I was a history teacher and had a very similar experience, but instead of religion, I did emotional behavior disorder special education. So I have empathy for you.
And I guess with religion, and you have to ask questions. You have to love dialogue, because otherwise I could not have taught it, because I think, that for me was core to create like a safe space for students to discuss difficult topics with each other about the world, about themselves. And I really wanted it to be a respectful place, and, where opinions could clash and you could differ from opinion, but it would not end up in fights and stuff like that. So I guess there is where my love for questioning and inquiry really started, because I needed to ask the right questions to get the conversation started. And also questions are at the heart of trying to understand the other.
Well, I'm going to resist the temptation to follow that thread. And my guess is, because I usually come back to that at some point, it'll resurface. But let's talk about formative action.
Yes.
So why, looking at some of your work, I think I understand, but kind of explain, why should we be shifting from formative assessment to formative action? Explain that for us.
Yeah, well, I guess they're in the core, of course, there's nothing wrong with the title or the term formative assessment. But I guess one very big lethal mutation, as I like to call it, or as we like to call it, what you see in education is that we become too tool focused or too activity focused, maybe sometimes, and we lose sight of the goal and of the purpose. And I guess by reframing it and renaming it or rebranding it, it really helps to put the right emphasis. Like, it's not about assessing or, because the pitfall there is that you assess way too much, that you ask way too much questions, and that it becomes really difficult to act upon it. So that's what at least we saw in the Netherlands, is that people thought that formative assessment was an assessment without a grade, and if you were lucky with feedback, and that was it. But I guess as we see it, is that in the heart, it's about pedagogy, and it's about focus, and about asking a question or a couple of questions, but it helps to, focus a lot and be really specific in what you want to know about the learning of your students. So it becomes way more easier to really act upon it, because that's the whole game. That's the whole thing, is that somebody has to change their, behavior. Is that because you make this informed follow-up action, you make an informed decision. So you collect information to be able to make a better decision about what to do next, what could be the next step. And of course, it's very helpful if you think of that beforehand, etc. But I guess that's the reason why we changed the name. And what we see in the Netherlands is that it really helped a lot to get the right focus.
I want to go back a little bit to your teacher training, and the description of your colleagues as you were, I guess, a rookie or a new teacher, and the sort of lack of response of being particularly helpful. One of the things that we talk about in our professional development, professional learning work, and I emphasize, and I think is really important, is that sense of being intellectually rigorous, right? So how do we continue? We want all of our educators to be continually refining their craft and hopefully looking to have those kinds of conversations, right? And I think that's also a part of how we would ostensibly attract and retain teachers and good teachers, because there's a sort of intellectual nourishment that comes with those conversations that I would venture to guess, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but our best teachers would value that, and maybe our less best teachers would not value that. And so I know when I left the classroom after 15 years, I felt like I wasn't getting that intellectual nourishment. I was starving for it. And teacher pre-service is not well known for being particularly great or rigorous, at least here in the States. And I don't know that that's unique to other countries as well. How would you characterize your teacher prep? Was it mostly good on a scale of 1 to 5? Was it a 5 or 4 or 3?
Well, yeah, this is a painful question. I guess if I would have like a magical wand, I would love to improve like teacher prep or teacher training programs, because
same.
Yeah, that's a big thing for me, because I think there's so much to improve. There's so much to do still. So if I look back at my own teacher prep, I liked it. I liked it a lot. And it was a lot had to do with history, which I'm happy about. So it was very content rich, and that was good. But I did not learn, in my view, a lot about assessment, the summative assessment. I had no clue how to do like a very, rigorous with validity and, stuff like that, and reliability. I had no clue how to build a good summative assessment. I learned working methods, I learned activities, school activities. I learned about, how you could use a game in history, and that was cool, of course. But if I had no mental model of learning and effective teaching and effective pedagogy, I had my mental models and my knowledge about that was very, very limited. So, and for me, the master program I did was a very eye-opening experience, because then I got way more insight into school development, change in schools and innovation. But also then I started reading all the other books that nobody told me about, or, pointed out to me, like there are a lot of books out there that you can find the knowledge that you were looking for. So I guess I did a lot after my teacher prep.
Yeah. So I'm and again, I don't want to get too far down this road, because I do want to talk about formative action, but it, I think, is definitely related in so far as that I've been thinking a lot about this lately, because my oldest daughter, who's about to turn 19, is in her first year of elementary education pre-service.
Nice.
And so I'm, trying to peer over her shoulder very nonchalantly to see, what are you learning? What are you working on? How is that going? And I can report, I've said this, I think, on the podcast here twice, but, a lot of the sort of science of learning crowd is really critical. And they say, well, they don't learn cognitive load theory. They don't learn all these, they're learning styles and all this stuff. I can report that in 2 semesters, she's had 1 class each semester where they have explicitly spent time disabusing the students of the idea of learning styles being real. So we're perhaps making some progress. But, I think back on my experience and now her experience, and she came with me to work with, I was working with a school, 2 weeks ago. And she said, Dad, I want to watch you work, which I thought, what a glutton for punishment. I was, obviously very happy to bring her along. And afterwards, of course, I debriefed with her, and she just has so little context, even having 2 parents who are educators, and my mom was an educator, my grandmother was. I mean, it's not like this is all new to her. She was a student, but she just doesn't have much context. And so I wonder how much and I don't expect you to have the answer to this, but how much if you and I and all teachers were really given a lot more of, let's say, cognitive science and things like that, how much of that would stick in the ways that we would hope it would? And I guess another wrinkle to that is I wonder how much of that was talked about, but didn't stick because we didn't have the context. And I'll stop talking in just a moment, but I'll add an example. There was one class I remember very succinctly in my teacher prep program where this woman was constantly, she used a lot of buzzwords and that irritated me, but one of them was schema. I mean, if she said schema once, she said it 100 times a day, it felt like. And so I just I was over it, but obviously schema is really important. But in that moment, I didn't really understand why or how it was important because I hadn't had a classroom yet. So I'm curious if you have any sort of reflections or thoughts on that, just from a teacher prep perspective and your work with teachers afterwards.
Well, we have I guess maybe it's a bit unusual system in the Netherlands. So you can go in two different ways. You can become a teacher, or we have a completely different level of education. We call it University of Applied Sciences. So it's not completely vocational stuff, but it's also not completely academic university. And to become a teacher, you can become a teacher through the University of Applied Sciences, or you can become a teacher through the academic university track. And then you have to do also an academic master first. And then after that, you can do it like a teacher master program. And then you have your teacher degree. I did the University of Applied Sciences because the academic university I could not do, because for me it was too much listening and sitting and not enough practice. But what is cool about the University of Applied Sciences is that you have to do internships from your first year on. So you're in a school and you have to teach constantly. Maybe, small bits of a lesson, and it depends on your internship and what you do as an individual. But I was teaching from my first year of, teacher prep. So I guess the context was there. But for me, like, lots of concepts were just not touched or talked about in any form in my teacher prep. So yeah, the context was really there. But also after when I just started working as a teacher, I remember asking my fellow colleagues questions. And what I see now, looking back or reflecting upon that time, is that also my colleagues did not know all that much about all those concepts that are out there. The books and the stuff is out there. But I guess the difficulty is that it's not finding the teacher prep and it's not finding a lot of people who have been working in secondary education for sometimes years. So that frustrates me sometimes, because I also don't really like the whole camp stuff. I think it's about balance, and you need to use both, and etc. But I would love that people would know a bit more.
Right. Yeah, a pluralism of perspectives and ideas and approaches, and a reflective process about them, and when and why, and all of those things. Yeah. So let's come back to formative action, because again, I'll talk about that stuff all the time. So looking at some of the resources and pieces that you shared with me, one of the things that I thought was interesting is the short loop of formative action. So you've got orientate, generate, evaluate, act, and then verify. So walk us through that process.
Yeah, I guess it's our own model. So we really tried to also make it very hands-on, very practical, but as clear as possible for teachers. That's, I guess, always what we're looking for. So how can we support teachers to use the underlying principles about learning, and then specifically about formative action, and make it as easy as we can for them, because teaching is hard and you're always busy, etc. So and Oliver Cavalioglu was also a guest on your podcast also
several times. Yeah, Oliver's great.
He's
a hoot.
He did the visuals for us, and I think they turned out really, really cool. So the first step is called Orientate, and that's really a mental step for you as a teacher. And I guess that is really different from the other models or about formative assessment or formative action that are out there. So the first step is really that you as a teacher need to think like, where am I going to? What are my learning goals? What is my lesson goal or lesson objective? And what am I curious about? Like, what are the questions that I want to ask my students to support their learning? What do I need to know about their learning to, support them in a better way? So, and then if you have a question in your mind, then you should also predict, like, what do I think how it will go? Do I think that a lot of them will have this, have trouble with this or that, or will know that pretty well, or etc. And the thing is here is that we really try to make sure that teachers think of this beforehand, because it becomes easier to act upon, the information that you collect when you have like 30 students in front of you. So this thinking beforehand is really important. And you also need to think about when am I satisfied? So when do I choose to move on? When do I think like, okay, great, this went well, they all know it, or they all get it, or etc. Or when do I think, ouch, they've forgotten this, or they're mixing up these concepts, or, this misconception is very annoying, it's still there. So I need to do, I guess, reteach. So it's about knowing your learning goals. It's about knowing what you want to ask your students and what is important to ask them. And it's about predicting like the answers that they probably will give, and also thinking ahead, like, what do I want to do then? Do I need to prep something? Do I need to prepare something? And then the second step is generate. So that's really the step that you want your students to generate answers. So they all need to think. That's really important here. That's one of the success criteria that we always say that goes along with the second step. So you want all students thinking, and you want all students generating an answer. So they all use, of course, retrieval practice and the testing effect. They all need to, remember from their long-term memory to their working memory. And then in the third step, you interpret or you evaluate. So you see the answers on mini whiteboards and fingers in the air on, etc. And then you can also ask deepening questions. So this is also the place where you communicate, and where you can give whole group feedback if you want, or you can organize peer feedback. You can say, of course, like, okay, turn and talk for a minute and compare your answers and come to a better answer, or stuff like that. But sometimes you also see answers of your students, and especially if you do like multiple choice questions, that you can ask like, hey, I see that you chose answer option A. Why did you choose it? Why did you pick that? Can you explain? So this is also a step where you can really, communicate about the answers, do some sense making also together. And then I always say that somebody has to decide how to move on. And and this is also, you as a teacher can decide. And when teachers are new to the whole concept, I always recommend, like, in the beginning, you decide. Because if you don't, as a teacher, if you don't have this if this is still a tricky thing to do for you, then it's maybe too difficult or too challenging already to let students decide. Because if you let students decide, that's amazing, of course, and very good to do, but you need to be able to suffer the consequences sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
You need to be able to cope with them, choosing the wrong things. And what I see happening sometimes is that a teacher came up to me and said, yeah, affirmative action of you, that doesn't work, because I let them choose what to do next, and they didn't, chose the right thing. So sometimes then formative action gets the blame, but it's actually, of course, self-regulation that's really hard. And, if students are still a beginner, then they don't know the whole domain, and it's very difficult for them to have, a clear decision. So it's good if you choose, but you can also do, like, in a dialogue together, you can choose what to do. And then comes the action. So the action can be reteaching, that can be more practice, that can be, I don't know, making a summary or a mind map, whatever you think is a logical thing to do, a logical reaction, a logical intervention. It's whatever you want to call it, but you have to act upon it. And then after you did the action, it's very important in the same lesson or in the next lesson. It's up to you. You can also cut the model wherever you want and split them up in like 2 lessons. I would not recommend in more than 2, but you need to verify. And we also love to call this 5th step a mirror question. So you need to look back and ask like a very similar question, like the question you asked in step 2, because now you want to close the loop. You want to make sure that all students got it now, and that your action was actually a good action. And this was for me a very humbling experience, because I did not do the 5th step in the beginning that I was using formative action in my classroom. And I was like, how would you say that? I just thought, I checked it, we talked about it, I did some reteaching, that should be it, right?
Right.
Good job. I did a good job. And then I did the mirror question. So the next lesson, I started doing like a similar question that I did in step 2. And I saw like, whoa, oops, some students are still not getting it. And that made me way more reflective, and I needed to look at my own actions and reflect, like, was this the best thing, or should I change it or do something differently? So the 5th step is about reflecting, looking back, but also making sure that everybody gets it now. So it's also a chance for a success experience, because if students were struggling in the beginning, but, we talked about it, we did something with it, and you're able to, to grasp it now, that's of course very motivating because you succeeded. And it's also good for self-regulation to reflect on the process. Like, okay, guys, what did we just do? How did it help you? What did you learn from this? What would you do next time? So also it's a chance to ask like more reflective and self-regulatory questions. So I guess that's in a very short summary.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, so these 5 steps here, they're not necessarily, it's not limited to just the sort of idea of formative assessment. It's essentially maybe the teaching process, right? Like figuring out what we have as outcomes and going through those process and verifying all that stuff. So I think that's important, because people, I think, might hear formative action and think, wait, this is formative assessment, or is formative assessment this is how you sort of enact it inside that context of a lesson. The one of the questions I have when we talk about the Orientate piece here, and I talk a lot about what I call knowledge-rich inquiry. So I think there's some similarities, but we certainly I want 3 sort of outcomes. One, which is engagement, which is not just are they paying attention or having fun, but intellectual, cognitive, academic engagement. And I really preach that, and people who listen to me know that if you're doing project-based learning or inquiry-based learning and you're not cognitively engaging kids, I'm likely to be pretty critical, and maybe have lost some professional friends over that issue. But I think about the engagement piece, but then also, so when we think about orientation or orienting, like I want not just learning, but I want thinking and learning, right? So I want students to think about the things I want them to think about, but also in the ways I want them to think. And I think that's a wrinkle that maybe sometimes gets overlooked, right? That I like Hattie's surface deepened transfer. There's other sort of frameworks, right? But that we are clarifying the ways in which we want them to think and learn. There are some things that we want them just to know, right? Can they tell us here in the States the 3 branches of government, and just sort of tell us that, right? Or a historical fact or whatever it might be. that's much different from thinking critically and some sort of deeper transfer kind of piece. So how do you sort of think about that in that? And I assume the sort of first step.
Yeah. So also the title of our book is From Instrument to Design. So what we did is we really tried to connect the pedagogy and the activities to the curriculum, and because we see that it's necessary to do formative assessment or formative action in the correct way. You need to have a very clear vision and clarity as a teacher about your curriculum, about the build-up, about the structure, about, as you were just saying, like, what do you want them to just know? What do you want them to do? What do you want them to think critically about? And because if you have like a very clear map in your head about the curriculum and the buildup of the curriculum, but also the pitfalls, what are the typical pitfalls? For me, that was, I always tell this, but it was a very big learning experience, was Martin Luther, the reformer, the Christian reformer, and Martin Luther King.
Right,
and
right.
my students were interchanging them. Pretty painful, by the way, but that was, for me, I remember it so clearly because it was so funny to me. But at the same time, I was like, oh, this is a pitfall. This is a misconception for my students. So
yeah, here in the States, it would be 3 branches of government and 3 levels of government. That's a classic pitfall.
Exactly. Yeah. So I guess every, subject has their typical pitfalls in learning it, and also for you then in teaching it. So I guess what we try to do in the first step is already connecting the pedagogy to your curriculum and making sure that it's not just a separate activity, because that's also what I noticed when I was in Thailand and, traveling, is that this is a common thing for a lot of teachers. Is we're busy, our head is full, we need to do lots of things, and we need to do formative assessment or formative action. So, okay, I'm doing the mini whiteboards. Check, done. I asked the question, but it's not about checking or ticking boxes. It's about, you want to use the pedagogy in the most effective way, and you want to use it to support your students better. But if by really wanting to do that, you have to have a clear vision and concept about your curriculum and the build-up. So I guess in the first step, there is already the connection is already there. And what we also did is that the short loop of formative action is one of the 3 strategies, as we named it or called it. So we say like formative action is a package, as you could say, about effective pedagogy. And there are 3 strategies that all have a scientific, principle or a scientific core. So the short loop of formative action, of course, is about retrieval practice, checking for understanding, and etc. And scaffolding. And the other 2, the one is called sense for quality, developing a sense for quality. And that has to do with, using examples or exemplars and modeling and doing a think aloud to make sure that students know the end goal and what's expected of them. And the other one is feedback processes, or organizing effective feedback processes to make sure that your students become more independent. So over time, and especially if you are working on like a paper or an essay or an art project, is that you need to organize the feedback in loops, or it's an iterative process. And you have to make sure that with every feedback process or every feedback moment or every moment, you try to make sure that it is a bit more work for the student than it is for you. So I always say like that directive and corrective feedback are fine, but only in the beginning of the learning process, only when students are still novices. And I guess it's very challenging for teachers, because I guess a pitfall for us is that we keep on, with all our love, giving directive and corrective feedback. But in that way, we're not making students more independent. Because I always like to compare it to like swimming lessons or learning a play for theater. In the first period of learning how to, do the scene, it's okay for the, what's it called, for the, what's the name of the for the director to just, to whisper the text to you, because
Cue.
cue it to you, because you're still practicing and you're learning your lines, you're learning your text and everything. But after time moves on and you come more towards the real thing and, doing the play with an audience, you have to make sure that the director says, okay, now you do like 3 scenes on your own, and I won't say a thing, and then reflect afterwards, and you even do like a grand rehearsal. So I guess we need to also build that in when we give feedback. We need to make sure that we scaffold the feedback, actually.
Yeah. So one of the things that I keep having conversations about, and I think that this is really important in the formative assessment or action world, and it's in summative as well. But if we're looking at sort of surface deep and transfer, or whatever that might be, you love questions, I love questions, the sort of inquiry process. But when we look at just sort of surface knowledge, that is easily quantifiable in most cases. But of course, there are other dimensions to the thinking and learning we want students to do. And some of that is much less easily quantifiable, right? It's much less measurable. And I think this is a frustration or a critique of something that might be inquiry based on how do you know if it's working well, and how do you know those kinds of things. So whiteboards, mini whiteboards for answers are great, but not everything fits on that, right? And I think you shared with me a resource where a history teacher is talking about exit tickets as a way to assess some of those things. But if we're moving, and hopefully are moving, from just knowing stuff to understanding and making meaning of things, that's a generally much less efficient process to get there, and also to formatively assess. So how do you think and talk with teachers about that process of some of the things that are, let's say, a little less efficient in terms of gathering that, I guess, the evaluate stage?
Yeah. I guess because I taught history, and as we said before, like, history is of course every topic has its own challenges, but I guess what's challenging with history is it's all you can negotiate in so many ways. Like, if you look at from this way or this angle or from that angle, everything is then possible. It just depends on how you look and what's your perspective. And so it's you can easily have different perspectives on like just one historical fact. So
right,
what I did, and I don't know how that is in the States, but in the Netherlands we do a lot with cartoons also, and that students need to look at and assess a historical cartoon, and then also arguments like, is this source reliable? So they have to look at different sources, reliable, and what could be the view of the maker of the source or the cartoon, and etc. So then the assessing and the generating can be quite quick, and I used Padlet actually a lot. So that's of course just a digital post-it wall, but it was easier also for longer text or longer answers. And then I would just read it as it would come in very quickly. And I always would love to just have a classroom dialogue about the answers that they gave. And sometimes that took quite a while. And we did a lot of sense making by talking about the different answers that we gave. And sometimes it became a whole discussion, but it was a very, very, I guess, a very good thing to do. And also we learned a lot, and I did then sense making in the evaluation and interpreting phase with my students. And then sometimes I decided that would then be my action, to do another one, to practice one more, or to watch a movie or a small film to see it from a different angle or different perspective, and then ask another question in maybe the next lesson or the same lesson. So I guess Yeah, mini whiteboards can be limited for long answers, so that's why I used then Padlet or something, and then I did a large classroom discussions about the sense making and understanding the different viewpoints and etc. So I guess it can still be done, but you have to look critically on the working method that you pick.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real, I guess maybe a paradox, and there's a tension there. One, which is efficiency and time, and you get into, okay, so you've checked, you've gotten to the verify, and you still have a significant number who don't get it.
Yeah.
And so then ostensibly go back and try something different, perhaps, or maybe try the same thing, but you reteach it, whatever, right? You're taking some action, hence the term formative action. But how many times can you rinse and repeat, right? So, if we want to get 80% of the class to, some sense of, I think they got it, but we're at 75 for 6 months. I mean, that's a bit of a hyperbole, but having taught supply and demand economics to ninth graders, maybe not that much of a hyperbole.
Yeah, no, I really understand that question. And I guess it's also a very, very important question to ask. And it's about, because it comes down to the system. So that ideally, we could rinse and repeat as long as we needed to give the right support to the right students. And this is why I always love to use swimming lessons as a metaphor, because when, I don't know how's it in the States, but in the Netherlands, everybody, gets their diploma in the end. But because the grandparents are already invited and sitting there with flowers and taking pictures, etc. But the difference is that the one kid, gets their diploma after 8 weeks, and the other one needs to do like a year and a half of swimming lessons before they can, have their swimming diploma. So, and I guess we don't give swimming lessons, and that is difficult for our teacher heart and for our teacher's soul, I guess, because we want to support our students and we want them all to, have their swimming diploma. We all want them to, have a party at the end and succeed and etc. So I guess the system that we teach in here is also the limiting factor, is that we say, actually, you don't have to learn this content or these learning objectives or these learning goals, but you have to learn them in this time. So the time is limited. The swimming lessons time is limited. We say you need to learn how to, stay afloat in 7 weeks. And if you cannot, stay afloat, we'll still go to the deeper bath and we'll throw you in and we'll see if you make it or not. So I guess that's the tricky thing in the educational system that we work with. And that,
yeah, well, there's that tension of a finite amount of time, and every instructional approach and everything that we do as teachers, and this is part of why teaching is so difficult, is because you're constantly in that decision-making mode of what are my trade-offs?
Yeah.
And what's the opportunity cost for doing this versus that? And this is something that I think is left out or overlooked, or I keep trying to emphasize this in my conversations online and such, in sort of the debate of, explicit instruction versus inquiry and so on. You say, well, what's the best way to teach this? And you say, well, it depends on, as you've identified, like what are the outcomes we want?
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that we're clear on those. But I think it's also important to recognize, while probably most classrooms might have a very similar set of outcomes that they would agree on, there are some variances, there are some differences, and therein lies the sort of choice that you have to make, which then flows down into the assessment pieces and how you're going to use that time. And so it's a constant decision-making process of a teacher.
Yeah.
one of the things that I often say with teachers when I'm working with them is that really great teachers have great perception skills. They're very perceptive, right? And I wonder, I'll be talking with David Geary about biologically primary and secondary. Maybe it's a biologically primary skill. Maybe it's a secondary. I don't know. Maybe I'll ask him. But I mean, formative assessment or action. I mean, you're trying to perceive, trying to get what's in kids' heads out so you can act on it if necessary. So are there things that we can do that are either teachable or trainable to increase and improve teacher perception? Is it just practice? Is it modeling and feedback? Is it all of the above? Or is it just some are good at it and some are maybe not so good? And so that's a biologically primary skill.
I guess you can really learn it. I would say it's definitely trainable, because otherwise I would be very unsatisfied with what I'm doing. So that's my core job now. I've been doing for years. So I really try to train teachers in this perception and in these skills that are needed. And I guess it's a combination of two things. So the one that we talked earlier about, it's about knowing your curriculum and knowing the buildup of your curriculum and having a clear view. And we also have working methods how to crack that code. I really struggle with that, actually, with history, because history is endless. Where are what's the how do we look at that? So for me, that was a big thing, a big struggle. But when I finally cracked the code, a whole new world opened up to me. And I remember saying to my colleague, like, oh, I see the line now. I see my curriculum, I see what I want to do, and I know which questions to ask. So what we do actually is that we ask teachers to make like sort of mind map. We call it a pedagogical road map, a PEDRO for short. So
that's dangerously close to a really bad word.
PEDRO. And so pedagogical roadmap. So we ask teachers to draw it out using backwards design. So going from your end goals or your main goals, and then work backwards, of course, and then make like this very big mind map of how all the goals and the sub goals and the prerequisite knowledge are related to each other, and not about activities, just about, the content. How is the content related to each other? What do students need to grasp first? What concepts do they need to grasp first before you can introduce, the other ones or the bigger ones? So, and by mapping that out for yourself, that for me was such an eye-opener. Then I could see what to ask. So I guess that's one big chapter. And the other chapter is about the classroom activities. It's about the techniques. It's about, are you using the right techniques? Are you, using it effectively? And for me, instructional coaching closes this gap, because I was actually really sad a couple of years ago, because I was pouring my heart and soul into trying to give the best professional development about formative action I could do. And then I remember I had like this amazing group, and they would always turn up. They always had their homework done. And I was working with them like for 2 years, and they were so reflective, and they could talk about formative action in such a very clear way. And then after 2 years, I went into their classroom to do lesson visits. And I remember like almost crying and going out of the school, because I was like, is this it? Is this what I taught them? Is this a level? Because what I saw was that they were falling out on techniques. They were having trouble with the techniques. So they grasped the concept. They grasped, their curriculum, but they were having trouble with using the mini-whiteboards in an effective way, or etc. So for me, this is why I also love instructional coaching, because for me, that is where you can close that gap, and also then work on the techniques. So you make sure that the teacher is able to ask the right questions from their curriculum perspective, but also do it in a very effective way in the classroom.
Yeah. So as you were talking about that, it reminds me of the sort of distinction. I was doing some work and thinking more about desirable difficulties and the work from the Bjorks, and I think performance, which is kind of maybe what you were seeing in the adult only sessions, right? But I forget what they use as the ideal, but they haven't made meaning of it in a way that they're able to apply it, and so that's a real leap. That's a real problem. I mean, the formative assessment, that essentially that's what you were doing, right? You were going in and seeing it and realizing, oh, we've got a problem here.
Yes.
And then I would assume you went into the phases in the loop and let's reteach this and think about this, right? So when we're talking about the idea of perception and formatively assessing and getting kids what's in their heads out, I think that one of the great sets of tools, I don't know if you're familiar with them, but Project Zero's from Harvard, their thinking routines are really great tools for that. So we use, some of those in our workshops and recommend them. I would characterize them as sort of, when I talk about inquiry, I differentiate between intentional inquiry and intuitive inquiry. So intentional is the intentional use or planning of, let's say a thinking routine or some question formulation technique or something like that. Intuitive is sort of the skill of the teacher, the craft of being, artful and pushing and pulling and that kind of thing. And so, I think that this is an example. So let's say a thinking routine like parts, purposes, complexities. And so we might have students identify the parts of something, talk about and reflect on the complexities of the purpose and the complexities. And then as that thinking becomes visible, that's essentially a formative assessment tool that you can then take formative action. And I think about that inquiry as a learning tool in ways that I sometimes wish the sort of cognitive science sense of learning crowd would maybe take a little bit more seriously. So I'm curious how you think about, obviously questions are an important, vital part in cognitive science and science of learning. Folks talk about that regularly, or most of them do. But I think essentially those inquiry moves, like a thinking routine or a question formulation technique, or some of those Socratic seminar fishbowl conversations, history, if you're not familiar with 4-question method, a couple guys have created that here in the States. And I think that's a great tool, again, to sort of make some of that thinking visible. So a long way to ask this question: how do you think about inquiry, not just questions, but inquiry in terms of formative assessment and then formative action?
I think it can go really well together, and it depends on what the teacher has as a goal for formative action, what they want to achieve with their formative action loop. So if it's more about sense making maybe, or the dialogue, etc., then I would definitely say that using inquiry would suit and would, fit with the goal that the teacher has. And if it's more about right and wrong and, knowing something or a historical fact, and you just want that in the long-term memory of your students, or optimization, or, something that has to need to go fluent, then I would say, yeah, okay, then use mini-whiteboards, or, really make sure that you use retrieval practice as well, or the testing effect to, incorporate that in your formative action loop. So I guess, and that my colleague and I actually wrote a blog about this, about 8 reasons for formative action, is that it all depends on what you as a teacher want to achieve with the formative action loop. So again,
it depends.
Yeah, it depends. And I guess inquiry could definitely fit there if it aligns with your goal about the whole formative action loop.
Yeah, and that's why I say it depends. And so if you are okay with maybe efficiency not being your top priority, then inquiry can be a really great tool. But if efficiency is a top priority, then it's probably not going to be the best tool. Although you can make an argument sometimes you can go slow to go fast, and I won't go into those weeds here. One last question. No promises. I always say one last, and I think, well, do I want to limit myself to that one last one? You mentioned earlier the sort of idea of sustainability in professional learning and that process, right? And I'm in the same boat. Like, we want to have that kind of impact with schools. But it's such a challenge for so many reasons, right?
Yes.
One, not the least of which, is that schools don't have the funding or the time or logistics to engage in sustained work, which is what it takes. But then there's some other things that are, in that equation as well. I'm not even sure how to ask this question or what the question is, but it's like, how, I guess, what do you do? How do you and your colleagues think about what are the things that help make that work sustainable? And if another wrinkle is, and my guess is you've been presented with this challenge, and we certainly have, is that the school says we can't do all of those things. We can only do these things. There's a colorable argument to say, well, then we're not going to do anything with you because we know it's not going to be as impactful as we want. But then there's also the argument of, okay, so maybe it'll open the door, and if we can get in that door, then maybe we can do more.
Yeah.
Or the sort of third option, which is, if they don't do it with us, they'll do it with somebody else, and it'll be maybe worse. Maybe it'll be better, but maybe worse. So yeah, how do you think about that sustainability issue?
Yeah. So, oh man, this could be another podcast.
Yeah, it's a French goodbye, they say, right?
So I've been obsessed with this topic, actually, because it was the main thing also of my master. It was learning and innovation. So I don't know if I have the answer. I try to do in everything, in every conversation, in everything that I do and work with schools, I always try to touch upon this topic. So if they just ask me for a keynote for a professional development day, I always ask them about, okay, and how does this keynote then, fit into your bigger plans? And I always make time for those conversations as well. So then if I notice that they don't have a clue, and we're just focusing on that, one-off day, then I will try to, ask more questions to dig down a bit deeper and see what's there. And then if I feel that they invite me to it, because I also don't want to be very dominant, in that, you should do this and that, and why have you, didn't think of this?
Challenging, right?
It's very challenging. So inquiry really helps here, I guess, and having good communication skills. And then I try to politely show them, like, it could be of benefit, or it could be a good idea to think about durable stuff and implementation, and how do you want to follow up after the keynote. And then I always share very openly, like, lots of work that I have, or examples or assignments, because I want to support schools. I don't want it to just be a one-off and, earn my money, earn my living, and then say, okay,
Right.
goodbye. That was it. And I know it won't have any impact. So with my colleagues, we're constantly also when we have like these internal days with all our colleagues, we are actually constantly in dialogue with each other. Like, how can we support schools better and better and better in this aspect? So that's also why we started up a leadership program to support school leaders more, because we saw that was also, of course, they are in a key position, and they need to have enough knowledge to then also support the whole innovation, or what they're doing, and being able to make good decisions. So we did a lot of things. I actually made a free website in the Netherlands for free, built upon the EEF materials, to just assist schools with, helping them to see the overview also, because that's also what I noticed. I don't know how it is in the States, but what I see in the Netherlands is that lots of times schools just have no clue about implementation, about durable implementation. They have and they're quite helpless, and sometimes are in panic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know where to start, and then they just call you up and say help, and then it's really a tricky thing to not go into the, what do you call it, like the superhero mode, and say no worries, I will save you.
Right.
Yeah. It's tricky.
So I said the last question, but now I've got a follow-up question. Because you said the word durable, and I like that word. I've been promising myself to use that more, but now you've reminded me that I haven't been using it. But sort of durable learning, right? Which is related to sustainability. So it's a follow-up question to sort of leadership and professional learning, but we want learning, and I know the idea that learning is a change in long-term memory is one way to just define learning, but that also doesn't necessarily address the retrieval, right? So if it's in memory, then it's ostensibly there forever, or as long as we're alive, and then we may or may not be able to retrieve it. And that begs a question that I think is related to formative assessment and action, and all teaching just in general, right? And I think a critique that that is worth considering with any teaching, whether it's inquiry, explicit instruction, but this idea that we are assessing, whether it's formatively or summatively, and we have a sense that they understand, they know it, and maybe even understand it, but will they know and understand it in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? A great example that I use here in the States is our states and capitals, where most of us were meant to memorize all the states and capitals. But, when I go into a room of teachers and I say, what's the capital of Wyoming? Half of them will get it right or wrong, unless, of course, we're in Wyoming, and they will all know it, or, something like that.
Yeah.
So how do you think about that sort of not just assessment of will they get it now, but then not that you could know now that they will know it in the future, but I guess reckoning with that sort of tension.
Yeah. And that also connects to what you were saying earlier about the Bjork, and Bjork's told that, named it, of course, like performance. You can perform in the lesson, you can know it in the lesson, but it's not a guarantee that they will know it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 5 weeks. So again, it comes down to the roadmap to your curriculum design. And if something is so important and like a very important building block, which you really want them to grasp and have in their long-term memory, that you want it to be durable knowledge, then you have to come back to it over time, more often than once. Because if you just touched upon it once, that it's not a guarantee that they will actually have learned it as a change in their long-term memory. They can know it in that lesson. And so I guess again, this is why you need to know your design and have a good, clear instructional design and curriculum design to make sure that you use the right effective pedagogy at the right moment.
Yeah, and I think about it in terms of, again, if we're talking about retrieval cues, and thinking, I think Daniel Willingham said, thinking is the residue of thought, or some version of that. Then that's why I think not just learning, but thinking. So thinking and learning. So what are the various ways we're giving students to think about, especially those really important pieces? And inquiry, I think, is such a vital piece of that, right? So you can memorize things, and you can do that in a way that is, mnemonic devices or whatever. I don't know that that's necessarily as durable, although you can get it more durable. But when you are using inquiry and connecting it in different ways, you are creating additional retrieval cues that makes the retrieval stronger and more durable and all those things. So to me, the inquiry is just such a vital piece of that picture. So no question there, but and feel free to react to it before we start to wrap up here.
Yeah, and I guess also I like that thinking about inquiry and the necessity of students to think hard about the stuff that you want them to think about. And that's such an important aspect. So also with the other strategy, the sense for quality, if you use examples and use different examples, then again, on what aspect of the example do you want to focus the students' attention? What do you want them to think about? That's such an important question to keep asking yourself, I guess, as a teacher, constantly with everything that you do.
Yeah, and Paul Kirshner wrote a blog piece about contextual interference recently that I thought was great, and to me that is in many ways very consistent with what I would say is essentially intuitive inquiry, right? And could be intentional inquiry, right? You're giving different ways to think about it and forcing them to think about it in different ways, which means there's more residue. And but I also find that to be a really interesting tension with some of the sort of messaging that I see with cognitive load theory, which of course the Bjork say, you want some cognitive load, and I don't think, John Sweller wouldn't say we wouldn't want any load, but I think one of the explicit teaching advocacy things is, and I don't want to mischaracterize or strawman, but I think that there can be a sort of idea that, again, efficiency, and we want to sort of explain it so that they don't have to think about it as much as maybe, there's just a little bit of a tension there that I think is just really interesting. And again, explicit teaching is really important, but how do we, as teachers, this is the craft, right? How do we figure out when to be less explicit and less guidance and less of that feedback?
Yes.
And some of that is perception and formative assessment. So
yeah.
So well, I want to wrap us up here. I've loved the conversation, and I appreciate you having the conversation and joining me. I'm sure there are places you want them to find your work. Is it formative-action.com? That's the main site, but where else? And I know you're on social media. And
I'm mainly on LinkedIn, so please follow me there if you want to know more and follow the discussion about formative action. I post regularly. So yeah, would definitely be the place.
Okay. And so formativeaction.com with a dash between formative and action. And we'll put that in the show notes. Any other places that you'd like them to visit or see?
I guess if the LinkedIn and the website is a good place. And we also have a short English podcast that is called Learn Bites podcast. We can also put it in the show notes, I guess. That's also
yeah. Okie dokie. Well, like I said, it's been a real pleasure. And thanks so much for the time and the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.